Anthropological Theory by John McGee and Richard Worms. Structure, Language, and Cognition. By the middle of the 20th century, American anthropology was largely dominated by the students of Franz Boas, practicing culture and personality-inspired fieldwork, and others who followed materialistic approaches. Marxism and structural functionalism were the primary approaches in Europe. However, in the 1950s and 1960s, the United States and Europe each produced influential perspectives that focused on language and cognition. The American approach was heavily influenced by the cultural relativistic ethos promoted by Franz Boas and his students. While European theory was introduced by the 19th century, emphasis on cultural similarities and psychic unity. The concept of psychic unity was deeply entrenched in the evolutionary thinking of 19th century scholars. The German ethnologist Adolf Bastian, 1826 to 1905, was particularly influential at this time, and his concept of Elementargedanke, hereditary elementary ideas, was widely adopted in evolutionary reasoning and was fundamental to the notion of psychic unity. Bastian also proposed that geographic and historical circumstances created different local variations of those elementary ideas that he called Volkergedanken, folk ideas. For Bastian, co-founder and first director of the Museum of Ethnology in Berlin, discovery of these elementary ideas was one of the primary objectives of anthropology. This perspective found its way into the 19th century French thinking in the work of Émile Durkheim, who studied in Germany from 1885 to 1887. The work of Bastian and Durkheim provides the background to help us understand the thinking of Levi Strauss and his search for the universal structures of human thought. Claude Levi Strauss, 1908 to 2009, almost single-handedly founded the field of French structuralism. Levi Strauss was born in Brussels and grew up in Paris. He studied law and philosophy at the Sorbonne, graduating with a degree in philosophy in 1931. In 1935, he accepted a position as a visiting professor of sociology at the University of Sao Paulo, while his wife, Dina Dreyfus, 1911 to 1999, served as a visiting professor of ethnology. The couple lived in Brazil from 1935 to 1939, and Levi Strauss conducted his only fieldwork during this period. Though Levi Strauss rarely mentions her, Dreyfus was an accomplished scholar in her own right. She was born in Milan in 1911 and immigrated with her family to France when she was 13. Dreyfus graduated from the Sorbonne with a degree in philosophy that included a certificate in anthropology. While at the University of Sao Paulo, she founded the first ethnological society in Brazil with Mario de Andrade, an important Brazilian poet and ethnomusicologist, in 1936 and 1938. She conducted field work with Levi Strauss and a Brazilian colleague, Luiz de Castro Ferreira, who became a critical figure in the development of anthropology in Brazil. In 1938, she left the field because of an eye infection and returned to Sao Paulo and then to Paris. When war broke out in 1939, Dreyfus separated from Levi Strauss, but they did not divorce until 1945. Prior to the Nazi occupation of France, Levi Strauss moved to New York City, while Dreyfus participated in the resistance under the name of Denise Roche. After the war, she became a professor of philosophy. She taught at Versailles, at Lycée Molière, at Lycée Fenelon, and at the Sorbonne. She was the first female member of the Inspection Générale de Philosophie, the IG evaluates all aspects of philosophy education in French schools at all levels. Dreyfus was particularly interested in education and in popularizing philosophy, and in the 1960s she produced television and radio programs that featured conversation with famous philosophers. She died in 1999. In 1948, Levi Strauss returned to France to pursue his PhD at Sorbonne. His first book, The Elementary Structure of Kinship, 1949, was part of his thesis work. Levi Strauss' structuralism begins with the assumption that culture is first and foremost a product of the mind. Following Bastian and Durkheim, he reasoned that since all human brains were biologically similar, there must be deep-seated concepts or ways of thinking that are the same in all cultures. He did not use a term similar to Bastian's elementary ideas. The goal Levi Strauss set for anthropology was to discover the fundamental structures of human thought. Pursuing his quest, he spent his career conducting cross-cultural studies of kinship, myth, and religion. The titles of his early works, The Elementary Structures of Kinship, Structural Anthropology, The Savage Mind, show the trajectory of his thinking. In particularly, The Elementary Structures of Kinship echoes the title of Durkheim's great work on religion. The elementary forms of the religious life. Levi Strauss believed that there were underlying cognitive processes tying cultures together, and that these could be discovered in bits of information that provide messages about the structure about the structure of society. However, each culture was also the product of its own history and its technological adaptation to the world. These processes combined, altered, transfigured, and modified the original elementary ideas. For Levi Strauss, transmitting culture was rather like playing telephone or whispering down the alley in a crowded bus station. Messages are apt to get jumbled. Levi Strauss hoped that by breaking down cultural elements like folktales into their elemental parts, he could get beyond this noise and recover these original messages. The Prague School of Structural Linguistics, organized in 1926, also played a supporting role in the development of Levi Strauss theory. Up to this time, the most influential work within linguistics was historical linguistics and Ferdinand de Saussure's 1857 to 1913 work in semiotics. However, the Prague School scholars, led by the linguistics Roman Jacobson, 1896 to 1982, and Nikola Trebotsky, emphasized the phenomenon study of language and promoted the theory that linguistic meaning was built upon binary contrast between phenomenons. This work and his study of Durkheim provided Levi Strauss with the concept of binary contrast that was fundamental to his formulation of structural analysis. Following the linguistic model, Levi Strauss proposed that the fundamental patterns of human thought were encoded in binary contrasts such as black-white, night-day, and hot-cold. This insight dovetailed nicely with Durkheim's and Hertz's proposition that distinctions such as sacred, profane, and right-left were fundamental manifestations of the Lamai collective conscience, or what an English-speaking anthropologist would call culture. Levi Strauss first applied the notion of the binary structure of human thought to analyze kinship in the gift. Marcel Mauss had tried to demonstrate that exchange in primitive societies was driven not by economic motives, but by the rules and reciprocity upon which the solidarity of society depended in. In Elementary Structures of Kinship, Levi Strauss took Mauss' concept of reciprocity and applied it to marriage in primitive societies. He argued that in those societies, women were commodities who were exchanged between kin groups. Levi Strauss contended that one of the first and most important distinctions people make is between self and others. This natural binary opposition led to the formation of the incest taboo. In this fashion, Levi Strauss claimed that the binary distinction between kin and non-kin was resolved in primitive societies by the reciprocal exchange of women and the formation of kin networks. Levi Strauss is best known today for his analysis of myth. His interest in mythology was founded in his belief that studying the mythologies of primitive peoples allowed him to examine the unconscious patterning of human thought in its least contaminated form. Much of Levi Strauss's work was on the folk tales of indigenous people of South America, such as the Nambicura. Levi Strauss had visited the Nambicura in 1938, but he also relied on ethnographic material of the Nambicura collection by Karl von Sinnen, a German ethnologist and physician who was a College of Bastions at the National Museum in Berlin, because he believed that binary oppositions were the basis of human cognition. Levi Strauss sorted elements of indigenous stories into sets of oppositions. He also proposed that a fundamental characteristic of human thought was the desire to find a midpoint between such oppositions, a category that transcends and somehow resolves them. In Levi Strauss's view, the elements of myth, like phonemes of a language, acquire meaning only as a consequence of certain structural relations. Therefore, to uncover the unconscious meaning of myth, the structuralist must break myth into its constituent elements and examine the rules that govern their relationships. In this way, the hidden structural elements could be revealed. Structural analysis was very popular in Europe, but in the United States, beginning in the 1950s, some ethnographers proposed a different methodology for conducting fieldwork they called ethnoscience. Ethnoscientists claimed that up to that time, ethnography had been unscientific. They complained that there was no single way of doing ethnography. Each anthropologist studied and wrote in his or own idiosyncratic way. As a result, ethnographers contained different sorts of information and were not analytically comparable to each other. Furthermore, ethnographers tried to describe native society and native understandings, but they did so using the conceptual categories of Western society. Ethnoscientists claimed that this distorted the results. To make anthropology more scientific, the ethnographic descriptions more accurate, scientists argued that anthropologists, to this end, they urged that descriptions of culture be couched in terms of native thought. Understanding native conceptual categories was key to this task. The ideal ethnoscientific ethnography would include all the rules, principles, and categories that natives must know to understand and act appropriately in social situations within their cultures. The underlying theoretical assumptions of ethnoscience was that cultures were set of mental models. It was the job of ethnographers to duplicate the features of those cognitive models so that they could think like a native. An ethnographer's model was presumed correct if it allowed them to replicate the way a native categorized phenomena. Because no one has a direct access to another person's mind, the cognitive principles and models drawn by ethnoscientists were based on what informants told them. Thus, the new ethnography drew heavily on the techniques of linguistic analysis. Like Levi Strauss, ethnoscientists drew on the methodology developed in the 1920s by members of the Prague School of Linguistics. Members of the Prague School studied the phonetic structure of languages by contrasting sounds in order to analyze the features that made sounds distinct. Ethnoscientists incorporated this idea into their research, but rather than contrasting sounds, they created diagrams in which contrasts of meaning could be outlined and the features of a native conceptual categories distinguished. Another set of linguistic principles upon which ethnoscience was based can be traced to their 1930s and the work of Edward Sapir and Benjamin L. Whorf, as one can see in Essay 12. Sapir and Whorf were interested in the relationship between language and thought. In numerous papers and essays, they proposed that language was not just a means of communication, but that it also shaped people's perceptions of the world, an idea later called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Whorf wrote, "We dissect nature along lines laid down by our native languages. We cut nature up, organize it into concepts, and ascribe significances as we do, largely because we are parties to an agreement to organize it in this way, an agreement that holds throughout our speech community and is codified in the patterns of our language." Sapir and Whorf's emphasis on the interrelationship of language and perception was one element that led ethnoscientists to see a close connection between culture and language. They reasoned that replicating the classification system of any language would give them the liability to view the world in the same way as the native speakers of the language. William Sturtevant outlined the fundamental principles of this new approach in his 1964 article, Studies of Ethnoscience. However, other ethnoscientists were already outlining the new research methodologies. In particular, Ward Goodenough and Charles O. Frake discussed ways to conduct field work and analyze data in this new approach. Goodenough, the key research instrument was the highly structured interview aimed specifically at eliciting native conceptual categories, which ethnoscientists called domains or taxa. They then used a technique called componential analysis to determine the definitive characteristics by which the objects and ideas in each domain were sorted. Using this information, ethnoscientists believed they could classify information according to native conceptual categories. In theory, data collection in this manner was more systematic and replicable, and thus followers claimed more scientific. Early attempts at ethnoscientific analysis, such as Floyd Lounsbury analysis of Pawnee kin terminology, concentrated on kinship, but the methodology was easily applicable to other areas and soon applied in a variety of research situations. Notable examples of this are Harold C. Conklin's study of disease categories among the Sabanan, Ralph Bulmer's 1967 study of zoological taxonomy, and in the highlands of New Guinea, and Brent Berlin, Dennis E. Breedlove, and Peter H. Raven's 1974 analysis of the Tsiqel Maya plant classification. The ethnoscientists' focus on understanding the native point of view was not new. In the introduction to the Argonauts of the Western Pacific, Bronzolo Malinowski had written that the final goal of ethnography was to grasp the native's point of view, his relation to life, to realize his vision of his world. The search for the native viewpoint also had strong resonances with Boasian anthropology. Franz Boas and his students insisted on the uniqueness of each culture. They collected masses of physical data on the material and behavioral existence of the people they studied and made the doctrine of culture relativism an item of faith among American anthropologists. Ethnoscientists continued the Boasian insistence on culture being sui generis and extended the search for data from the material to the mental, something Boas had first suggested half a century previously. Ethnoscience, like Boasian anthropology, implied an extreme cultural relativism, an approach that presented problems. Critics maintain that this approach made cross-cultural comparison impossible. If each culture had a unique way of conceptualizing the world and could only be described in its own terms, how could cultures be compared? Levi Strauss' structuralism was seen by some as the answer to this dilemma, but skeptics argue that it was impossible for either ethnoscientists or structuralists to get inside another's head and see how they thought or what they believed. A further problem concerned individual variation within society when ethnoscientists said they were trying to recreate cultural reality from a native's point of view. An obvious question to ask: which native? Despite these criticisms, ethnoscience was an important factor in the to ask was which native. Despite these criticisms, ethnoscience was an important factor in the development of at least two other theoretical approaches, cognitive anthropology and symbolic anthropology, that both achieved major prominence in the following decades. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the focus of ethnoscientific work began to diverge into different paths. First, instead of simply outlining native categories of thought, anthropologists proposed that by analyzing these categories, one could learn how the human mind functioned. Using models developed in linguistics, researchers proposed that there were universal cognitive processes that were a product of brain structure. In particular, a 1969 book by Brent Berlin and Paul Kay, Basic Color Terms, the Universality of Evolution, galvanized research in language and cognition. Berlin and Kay proposed that color perception was innate, thus challenging the linguistic relativism of Sapir and Worf. Berlin and Kay's work encouraged further research in areas like ethnobotany and ethnozoology. In this work, researchers focused on the way people classified their environments in an attempt to discover other universal patterns of human perception. A second approach is called cognitive anthropology and is closely related to psychology and neurology. By the mid-1970s, advances in anthropology, psychology, and the field of artificial intelligence had made it apparent that human cognition was much more complex than the models of the native classification. Derived from componential analysis suggested the earlier focus on domains and taxonomies gave way to a schema theory. A fundamental part of ethnoscience and the basis for componential analysis was the idea that people classified objects in their world by checking off a mental list of essential features. Apple equals red, brown stem. Rejecting this, cognitive anthropologists argued that people conceptualize by reference to general mental prototypes called schemas or schemata. Schemas are neurological pathways that humans build through life experience. When an athlete practices a skill over and over again until it is automatic, it is called building muscle memory. However, a muscle cannot remember. To a cognitive anthropologist, the athlete has created schema and special neurological pathway for that skill. Another way to think of schemas is that they are loci for neural processing that enables us to act quickly and without conscious thought. Thinking about where you want to go for lunch is a conscious process. However, a lunch schema is activated when you crave a hamburger but are repulsed by the idea of a cricket sandwich. Crickets are not part of the neurological lunch pattern you have created. To explain non-sequential thought processes in areas where thinking is non-linguistic, cognitive anthropologists and psychologists turn to the concept of connectionism. Those who follow Connectionist theory suggests that knowledge is linked, networked, and widely distributed by mental processing units, and that we access and analyze information through these mechanisms. Because these units are connected and work simultaneously, we can process information much faster than any computer. Notable scholars in this area are Claudia Strauss, Naomi Quinn, and Roy and Andrade. The essays chosen for this section reflect the development theory based on the structural and cognitive models through the last half century. In the first article for Winnebago Myths, a structural sketch published in 1960, Levi Strauss demonstrated basic aspects of his theory and methodology by comparing 4 Native American myths collected by Paul Radin. The second essay is an example of ethnoscience written by James Spradley. Spradley received an associate's degree from the Los Angeles City College in 1954. Served as a medic in the U.S. Army for 2 years, then he returned to major in psychology at Fresno State University, earning his degree in 1960. He then attended the University of Washington, where he studied anthropology, receiving an MA in 1963 and PhD in 1967. Spradley's first teaching position was in anthropology and psychology at the University of Washington. After 3 years, he moved to Macalester College, where he taught until his death from leukemia in 1982. David McCurdy, a college of Spradley's at Macalester, said Spradley was attracted to ethnoscience because it was useful, and wrote to us that Spradley was introduced to ethnoscience while working with alcoholics at a treatment center in Seattle. One day, after several months of observing tramps on Skid Row, in court and at a treatment centers, Spradley talked with a graduate student who introduced him to a more systematic approach to doing ethnography, called ethnoscience, and agreed to interview one of Spradley's informants at a treatment center. According to McCurdy, the interview lasted longer than 2 hours, after which Spradley claimed he had learned more about the lives of tramps than he had acquired in the previous 6 months of work. Spradley went on to teach a generation of McAllister students ethnographic interviewing using ethnoscience techniques, and co-authored several textbooks promoting fieldwork, including Culture and Cognition Rules, Maps and Plans, the Ethnographic Interview, and Participant Observation. The essay reprinted here is a chapter from Spradley's book, You Owe Yourself a Drunk. It is a classic example of etnoscientific writing, showing both the strengths and weakness of this approach. Here's the suggested readings, and this is the end of this chapter. Thank you.